You know, the 80s just had a distinct vibe. When someone says peak 80s, a bunch of stuff will come to mind, and you don't even have to specifically say what. It's kind of magical how decades worked back then. Things that could never be in the 70s, yet also never be in the 90s, existed with perfect chemistry in the 80s. Olivia Newton-John ushered in so much right here with her single Physical. New bodies, new fashion, new aesthetics, new sounds, and the bands we're going to talk about today were all pretty dominant, with synthesizers in tow, in establishing and defining the overall sonic zeitgeist of the 1980s. But no, we're not going to talk about them in the 80s. When the 90s came around, it's almost like everyone walked through a magic barrier where all their sparkles and shimmers touched gravity and came smashing to the floor. Some of it conscious, very much so, but some of it maybe even attempted to be retained and just lost regardless. How did these 80s titans of sonic synthesis fare in the natural light of the alternative 90s? As always, I'll link the videos in the description if you want to hear them in full. Now throw some fresh double A's in your Discman and let's check out some 80s synth rockers in the alt-rock 90s. Alright, we're going to start this look with Depeche Mode, who crushed it with massive 80s bangers like Everything Counts and People Are People. And we're going to skip 1990s Violator. It was cusp, it was amazing, it may be peak. It had an insane prescience with 80s transcending sounds predicting so much 90s vibration. But let's lock in for a sec with 1993's album Songs of Faith and Devotion and this single, Walking in My Shoes, because this is the heart of the beast.
Try walking in my shoes. Yes, stop running my footsteps.
I will divulge that I ride for this album and have for a long time. It essentially finds a band who has grinded long and hard at a peak of sorts with everything learned and nothing to prove. Songs of Faith and Devotion takes their heavily synthesized and sampled aesthetic and morphs into the 90s wasteland tastefully and honestly. They were always psychologically a good fit for a lot of the abandon and depravity exalted in 90s music culture, but they happen to find themselves at a good transition place technologically too. One of the big new developments implemented in Songs of Faith and Devotion was a computer program called Cubase, and rather than use it to super mechanize everything further, they actually let it loosen up their sampling and organic instrument blending. Old school samplers were really primitive and robotic and tight, but Cubase to these guys was a wider window, a bigger canvas, more flexible, and so they actively and consciously did a lot of real drumming, and when they did chop it up to make loops, they left the human variations intact. Multiply this concept by a whole album of arrangement, and you have a real vibrant and living, breathing synthetic beast. Then compound the fact that they absolutely had the songs, and you have an album that's no skips for me and holds up heavily all these years later. Later in 1997, we get one more 90s Depeche Mode album with Ultra. There's one big change here though, and it's the departure of member Alan Wilder, who actually was a big deal sonically. Wilder was really the one notorious for being the sampling freak, the deep diver, the texture maker, the guy with stacks of floppies back in the day just meticulously crafting sounds, and the guy who even likely heralded the vision for approaching Cubase's integration style on Songs of Faith. Ultra is not a bomb though, Ultra is great, but what you get as a result is this more streamlined and less textured 90s Depeche Mode. The songs are still there though, and singer Dave Gahan still sounds great. But essentially this is the point where their long rise and apex have come to collect on these guys. Years of tours, years of drugs, years on the road and in studios, the tale as old as time. But I do want to give props to Depeche Mode for not taking the Nine Inch Nails industrial rock cash-in train, because with all their image and outlook, it just seems like it could have happened so easily. Distort the drums and guitars and yell a lot. The single barrel of a gun might have a hint of it, and it's no doubt adjacent, but they stood defiantly and more strongly as themselves, even when their walls began to crumble and crash down. Listening back through Ultra, I was surprised how many heavy jams were on it. Some songs I might have misremembered for Songs of Faith even. So while it may lack the scope and texture and pinnacle point in time to me, it still has a lot to give. Okay, I think Duran Duran is a good place to go next because to me, this single Come Undone from 1993's self-titled album is a definitive early mid-90s linchpin jam. Like, it was everywhere and it sounded expansive to me even then. It actually served as a comeback after a failed 1990 album called Liberty. Come Undone sounded high-end. Depeche Mode may have joked about making music for the masses, but Duran Duran really did seem to make music for everyone, and I still liked them too. And it also, along with the other big single that preceded it, Ordinary World, sounded mature. I didn't even fully at that time grasp that Duran Duran of the 80s was responsible for literal genre-defining anthems like Hungry Like the Wolf and Rio. But what was amazing about Come Undone and Ordinary World too is they retained the same potency for songwriting and hook power, but blossomed it in a way. The way you hope it works when you grow as an artist. You don't want to sound like the how do you do fellow kids losers still trying to act like your younger self, but you don't want to get stale and drab. You hope you can do something like this. Evolve. Now, Come Undone also does just sonically sound very 90s to me. A bit on the adult contemporary side with its moody and hip, maybe even a little shabby chic vibe. But the real drama regarding Duran Duran's 1993 self-titled album is the rest of the album is not just a big departure from the two mega jams, but a ton of departures. It's a very eclectic album, and at times it actually still sounds dated for the time and 80s brain to me. Like lots of 80s production sounds, but maybe approached in a way that I would describe as where people in the 80s thought the 80s might go in the 90s if the 90s itself didn't come along and change it all. Do you know what I mean by that? So that's not a bad thing per se, it's an interesting thing. But, I'm saying interesting here, I'm certainly not saying words like timeless or great. At times, songs sound like 80s dance club jams, others dabble in world music. There's also randomly a cover of the Velvet Underground's Femme Fatale, which has its charms. So it's just funny, and worth noting that the band who might have had the most laser beam focused super 90s hit here did not have an album full of that focused vibe and strength. But Come Undone remains crucial, timeless and great. Okay, in 1995, Duran Duran drop a covers album, which includes a cover of Public Enemy's 911 as a joke. Props for that, go check all that out for yourself. And then in 97, we get one more 90s album with Medazzaland, and I don't even think I caught wind of this one in the 90s. Here we have the video for the single Electric Barbarella, and definitely this video wouldn't feel out of place with whatever MTV video playlist it was thrown into at the time. And it's playful and fun and all that, but when you've got songs like Wolf and Rio and Come Undone in your wake, this just isn't cooking with that level of heat. And also as a result, the band that sounded like they were for everyone at their most white hot doesn't sound as much for anyone when they're not. Depeche Mode still had dark and broody alternate synth jam loving weirdos like me flying their flag with Ultra in 97, but I think for Duran Duran the bottom fell out a bit in that regard. Simon Le Bon still sounds great, but the songs just aren't there, and you also have another fracturing here with founding member and bassist John Taylor leaving during production, so they kind of mirror Depeche Mode in that post-rise and apex fall. But a good little bit of happy ending to this one is that several years later in the early aughts, John Taylor comes back and guitarist Andy Taylor, who left in 86 even, comes back for a bit, and the band does some massive good touring on the Glory Years stuff. And they definitely deserved the victory laps. As an aside, one of the things that has blown me away is watching live 80s Duran Duran videos. If you thought because these guys were all pop songs and drum machines they'd be some karaoke band live, you are wrong. You might not know it from this video, but they were an insanely sharpened and honed live machine full of energy and precision that would put many pedantic musos to shame. Okay, next we're talking New Order, who rose from the ashes of Joy Division in the early 80s and kicked ass all decade, dropping explosives like Blue Monday and Bizarre Love Triangle like it was nothing. And for me, and many others too, really just delivering an entirely solid discography over 5 1980s albums. Because early on, they found their sound and they knew how to use it. They're one of those bands that have non-hits on albums that sound like singles you forgot about. Landmines everywhere. But by the early 90s, New Order was really already facing the strain of their concentrated ascent, and their 1993 album Republic was reportedly made on the brink of collapse. Not just of internal band tension like singer-guitarist Bernard Sumner and bassist Peter Hook wanting to kill each other, but the collapse of their longtime label Factory Records and its related venue the Hacienda too. A whole empire of sorts beginning to crumble. While Republic may have been a product created out of necessity to bail out some bad financial catastrophe looming large, it struck a little black gold with the single Regret, which became a staple of 90s radio, and I still associate with the windows down on a sunny day coming in over FM radio and a crappy old Pontiac catching a good breeze with an ocean of time and wonder on the horizon. New Order proved something implicit, which is that the goodwill of post-punk, new wave, and dance rock had informed enough young artists shaping the burgeoning alternative scene that New Order leaned on the sound of themselves and were welcomed to the party with a pretty warm regard. They were the band walking in, not drawing too much attention, smiling and nodding, "Hey, what's up?" blending into the action, and no one called it out or even thought to. This single Regret is definitely the most adapted sounding track on the album, with its guitar-heavy hook and its quite 90s modern-sounding verse loop mixed with real instrumentation. But it works mostly because atop that, once again, the song is so there. I'll take a little poetic license here, but Regret sounds, literally sounds, like the sonic version of the Brat Pack Kids that were dopey high schoolers in the 80s Breakfast Club, more grown up and getting out into their adult 90s lives. It has nothing to do with the Brat Pack, I'm just saying that's the energy it was giving at the time and kind of how it fit into me, and it worked in spades. Hey, do you think John Bender would have gotten into Seattle bands? So after Republic, like right on the heels of it essentially, New Order break up until the late 90s and don't give us another album until 2001. So before we move along, we can look at this second single from Republic called World, The Price of Love. I think this one is really indicative of the rest of the album, which really sounds like a continuation of 80s New Order to me. Just doing that thing I was talking about, being themselves, having their vibe, working up their mojo but not overly concerning themselves with adaptation or the cultural landscape or anything. The other thing worth noting is a year later in 1994, Nine Inch Nails covered Joy Division's Dead Souls on the soundtrack for The Crow, and really anointed Joy Division and by proxy New Order to a whole new generation of very young, very ravenous music fans with a penchant for the synthetically degenerated. I think if anything, and maybe as it relates to their proximity to a venue like the Hacienda and the general UK 90s club scene at the time, the band is pulling a bit more from the new electronic movement coming to fruition. And thus, before New Order bowed out for the rest of the 90s, they maintained their well-earned cool. Well, we can't look at New Order, Depeche Mode, and Duran Duran and not look at the freaking Cure. It's funny, even though The Cure started as more of a rock band, by the end of the 80s they unleashed the synthesizer-soaked sonic cathedral known as Disintegration and solidified a legacy. So when we hit 1992 with their first 90s album Wish, they're ready for a big sonic turn, which happens to be pretty harmoniously away from the synth layers and back into the guitar skronks and jangles, in part due to the departure of keyboardist Roger O'Donnell, who was a big part of Disintegration's synth ocean. But also just because after a dive as deep as Disintegration, that was simply the move. Wish doesn't just stroll into the 90s acting like it belongs and hoping to pass, though. It shows up dolled up in flashy attire and ready to be the life of the party. Hang hard, have some fun, and show the kids how it's done. The album is solid, but this is aided immensely by the worldwide hit Friday I'm in Love. A song so effortlessly whimsical, singer Robert Smith literally was convinced he stole it and that it couldn't have come from his own brain. And he was like calling people, begging them just to tell him who it was. And they were like, "It's you, dude." It was magic. For a band often cited as kings of goth, they sure can bring on the shine, the pop, the smiles, and the laughter. The Cure is actually a very silly, playful band, and Friday I'm in Love brought it and shared it with everyone. They also showed up to the 90s actively cool. Like what I was just saying about Nine Inch Nails covering Joy Division on the Crow soundtrack. Well, The Cure, the actual Cure, kicked the whole thing off with a new song called Burn, written for the movie, and Brandon Lee's whole character, the Crow, was heavily Cure looking, with his big frock of black hair and white face living in a sad and darkened world. In the 90s, The Cure were officially elder statesmen of dark and moody subculture kids. And all the new blossoming bands those kids were scribbling on their notebooks were all citing The Cure as influences. And this for them is the apex moment. And yeah, it does screw it all up and send it all crashing down in a big freaking mess, man. After Wish, guitarist Porl Thompson and drummer Boris Williams leave. Robert Smith self-admittedly just throws himself into a years-long party of indulgence, and that focus and that footing kind of slips away. In 1996, their second 90s album, Wild Mood Swings, drops, and it's got several drummers, goes all these different style directions. It's regarded as an unfocused mess, and I actually want to skip the singles and look at this other single, Wrong Number from 1997, a one-off new song for their second singles compilation album called Galore of that same year. Because for one, I think it's pretty good, but also it shows this glimpse of a really updated and vibrant Cure that totally could have been. On the recording, it's just Robert Smith with new drummer Jason Cooper and one-off guest guitarist Reeves Gabrels, who would actually join the band finally over a decade later and still then not even get an album credit until 2024's Songs of a Lost World, over a decade beyond that. But here he was in 1997 throwing down hard. Wrong Number blends the late 90s electronica influences into their realm. Or they blend themselves into that realm with a chameleon's ease. Songs like Savage Garden's I Want You, or even The Prodigy's Firestarter or the Chemical Brothers' Block Rock and Beats were making the radio rounds at the time, and this fit in pretty well. But it was a one-off. There was just not the focus and design to make an album like this. And so we're left with just a taste of something that was ultimately an unrealized dream. In truth, though, The Cure, like the others, spent the latter half of the 90s kind of blown apart, but technically functional. Hey, kind of like me.
Is there room in your life for one more?
Wow, as always, there was so much to say here we could only touch on little bits. And as always, there's more bands we could have looked at. There's some insane solo albums from Annie Lennox of Eurythmics, a couple of Tears for Fears albums without Kurt Smith that are basically Roland Orzabal solo albums, an interesting Aha album recorded at Paisley Park, lots of other stuff, but these were my big four, and I think it's interesting to note the parallels I never even really had considered before. How they all showed up still firing pretty solid shots, but just could not maintain the stress of the long-term pressure cooker beyond a certain point. Things always change, things always fall apart. But I love how all these bands made it around the corner, gave us some really cool stuff, and did it based on a genuine foundation of songcraft that, you know, they spent the entire 1980s cultivating. So if anyone ever tries to ride too high on the horse of the 80s just being fairy dust and dated sounds and excess and vacuousness, look to your post-punk new wave synth rock big dogs. Who knew they were the ones holding it down? Inevitably, there are more great examples, so shout them out in the comments and throw in any good stuff we were moving too fast to mention. This well runs deep, and I, for one, could drink from it forever. Luckily so, because,
Can't rain all the time.